One of the more famous passages in the New Testament, which I'm sure everyone knows, although not perhaps by chapter and verse, is often slightly misunderstood, I would suggest. So 1 Corinthians chapter 9, as the Lord says that we're called to be all things to all men. We're called to be all things to all men. And so just to be clear, that particular line, that particular passage is meant to invite us to exercise a certain flexibility when it comes to meeting people where they're at and journeying with people through the various peaks and valleys. So the example that comes to mind, Father John Ricardo, this American priest, he says, it's a bad reason to join a church because people are nice. It's a bad reason for people to join a church because people are nice. You want to join a church because what they teach is actually true. That said, be nice, right? So don't let the sharp edges of your personality constitute an obstacle for people receiving the faith, right? So you need to exercise flexibility, all things to all men. That said, what the passage doesn't mean is that we're called to jump at every opportunity to give of ourselves and to serve. And therein lies the problem. Like a lot of times we hear that, be all things to all men. What does that mean? Every time there's an opportunity, again, to expend my energy, to give my time and attention, I need to jump at the opportunity. And the answer actually is no, we're not actually called to do that, right? It's a subtle nuance when it comes to developing spiritual maturity. So the example that comes to mind that kind of framed the thing, I was watching this Instagram video, and it was a personal injury lawyer, actually. So he was talking about boundaries. And he basically began by acknowledging a lot of times we look at boundaries in a negative light, right? We look at it as a barrier to authentic and deep communication and relationship and whatnot. But he said, a more positive way to look at boundaries is that boundaries are basically the means by which I communicate to the world, through my words and through my actions, that which I find to be important and valuable. And funny enough, coincidentally or not, the gospel says pretty much the same thing, right? So today's gospel of Matthew chapter 11, specifically those last couple of verses, right? 28 to 30. Come to me, all you who are weary and find life burdensome, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. If you pay attention to the wording in the lectionary, it doesn't say meek, it says gentle, but the more accurate term actually is meek, right? So I think we talked about this before, but just to make sure we're on the same page, like meekness doesn't imply anything to do with social dexterity. So just because you're shy or socially awkward doesn't mean you're meek. It has nothing to do with that, right? So meekness is all about focus and discipline and direction. So the whole idea is that instead of being all over the place, jumping at every opportunity to give myself and serve and live my life, right? I'm focused on the few things the Lord wants me to do carefully and well. So I'll give you a few practical bits of advice that kind of dovetail with regards to this, right? So first of all, to have clarity about this temptation called the tyranny of the should. The tyranny of the should. So what's the tyranny of the should? There's a bunch of stuff out there that we could do, perhaps we could even do it better than other people. So there's time, there's opportunity, and there's a corresponding ability to pursue this particular good, right? But the question is, should I do it? And a lot of times what we think is that here's something I could do, and therefore I should do it. But you always got to keep in mind this really good expression by Rob Bell, this really famous Christian pastor. Basically what he says is that the enemy of the best is not the worst. The enemy of the best is the good. The enemy of the best is not the worst. The enemy of the best is simply the good. We're surrounded by all sorts of evil things, certainly, but also invitations to do good things, merely good things, which are not evil in themselves, but which fall just beyond the scope of what God actually wants us to do with our lives. Lord, just because I could do this thing, are you actually calling me to do it? And what you realize, actually, in the vast majority of cases, the answer is no. Again, the Lord wants us to focus on the few things He wants us to do carefully and well. Now, a corresponding concept is this notion of kind of entrusting to the Lord battles that He doesn't call you to fight. So again, a variation of the tyranny of the should. So the way to illustrate this point, think about anger. To realize, first of all, that anger is a gift. It doesn't seem like it most of the time, but actually it is. Anger is meant to be sort of like an honest friend who tells you there's something which seems to be off about a particular situation, right? So it gives people motivation and energy in terms of putting down evil things in the world. So that's the great thing about anger. At the same time, anger can be problematic, especially when it leads to this desire to destroy other people in this irrational sort of way. So obviously we need to rein that in. But here's the point, right? I was recently listening to a podcast that talked about emotions and anger, and apparently, this was a surprise to me, any given emotion, whether positive or negative, only lasts on average for 30 seconds. Not even a minute, like 30 seconds. So you might be like intensely angry, but actually if you let the thing play out, it only lasts for 30 seconds. And you might reflect on your experience and think, well, that doesn't seem to be true. I'm still angry about this thing which happened years ago, right? And what we tend to forget is that there's an intervening step, right? So you experience the emotion of anger, but then what happens is that we choose to kind of dwell on the thing, to savor it, to relive the experience of pain over and over again, and that's when it becomes something which lasts for hours and days and weeks and months and years. Whereas if you stop and pray into it, Lord, what do you want me to do with the experience of anger? A lot of times, if you think about it, the Lord calls you to just let it go. Or more accurately, to surrender it to Him. But therein lies the rub, right? So a lot of times when we hear that, okay, let this thing go, what we tell ourselves is like, look, if I correspond to this invitation to let go of this experience of anger, is it an admission of defeat? Am I saying to the Lord and to myself in a certain sense that, gosh, I'm like, this didn't matter. This experience of injustice didn't matter. My life doesn't matter. So a lot of times that's how we frame it. But the way to look at it is that I'm not surrendering this thing to the abyss. I'm surrendering this to God, to fight the battle that He doesn't call me to fight. That's why there's this really great expression in the book of Exodus. Remember how the Israelites are freaking out because the Egyptian army is in hot pursuit. And what does God say to them through the prophet Moses? Be still and know that I am God. And so the Lord is fighting all sorts of battles that we can't fight, that He doesn't call us to fight, because He alone can bring about the victory. So to kind of keep that in mind, right? Third practical bit of advice, just be really honest about what you need. I was listening to a podcast this morning, Restore the Glory, and one of the co-hosts, Jake Kim, he was talking about this. When you hear it out loud, it sounds pretty obvious, but it's just neat to hear him say it. He's like, look, I find in my own experience, if I have inner peace and I feel right with the Lord, I find it a lot easier to live a life of virtue and treat people well, right? It speaks to this duty that we all have to safeguard our sense of peace and recollection, and to be honest about what we need to maintain that sense of interior recollection. Just to cite a couple things. First of all, the habit of prayer. Again, you hear that and like, okay, what does that mean? Just saying prayers? Well, certainly that's part of it. But the way I like to think of it is like to have this regular habit where I carve out space in my day to allow God to tell me that He loves me. So imagine you have like a book written by a saint or a Catholic author, or maybe you have the daily readings, maybe you have the gospel, whatever. Something will speak to your heart. Something where the Lord can kind of, speak to you through this mediated thing. You are my beloved, you are cherished, and your value is not dependent on your ability to produce that which the world finds to be important and valuable. So this regular habit of prayer to carve out space to allow the Lord to speak to you all the time, I love you, right? So really, really important, right? Another thing that's really important to do in terms of self-care is to spend quality time with quality people. The Lord certainly calls us to interact with all manner of people, right? Some are easy to be with, some people are difficult to be with, right? But at the same time, the Lord sends across our path quality people that we can be ourselves with, who make us feel seen and known and loved. And to realize, well, no, that's really important that I carve out time to spend time with these people, not to rush it, not to squeeze it in, but quality time with quality people. One more thing with regards to self-care, patience. Patience. You got to realize the invitation is to love your neighbor as yourself, right? So to be patient, especially when it comes to moments of stress and fatigue. We all have a certain ideas of how our days are going to play out, right? But then what happens inevitably is we're going through our day, and we're not just tired and stressed, we're like unexpectedly tired and unexpectedly stressed. But what we tell ourselves in those situations is some variation of the tyranny of the should. I'm stressed, but I shouldn't feel stressed. I'm tired, but I shouldn't feel tired. And so we kind of push ourselves in those moments. But actually, the invitation is to be especially patient and kind to yourself when you're unexpectedly stressed and feeling overwhelmed. It won't take long, just like a moment where like, gosh, I'm unexpectedly feeling these things. I'm my first neighbor, I gotta take care of myself, regain a sense of peace and recollection, even though it wasn't anticipated or planned. A couple more contemporary examples, just to kind of flesh the thing out. So, this is a movie that I raised at Theology on Tap, right? So, Man of Steel. Obviously, it's about Superman, that really famous DC Comics character. And everyone knows who Superman is, but Superman is the superhero who can do like everything, right? So he can fly, super strength, super whatever, right? Hearing, X-ray vision, heat vision, and stuff. And the scene in question, it's early on in the film, where he's not quite Superman, but he's merely Clark Kent. So he's this little boy, He's in this classroom setting, and he's all over the place. So like the opposite of meekness, right? So he doesn't have a sense of focus and discipline and direction, but instead his powers are all over the place, right? So his hearing is causing a problem, right? So he can hear even the slightest whisper as this deafening noise. And his X-ray vision, forget about that, right? He's seeing through skin and clothes, and he can see skeletons and beating hearts and lungs that are going up and down. He feels so overwhelmed, he runs from the classroom and goes into his closet and he locks himself in. And they call his mother. And basically there's this whole thing of focus on my voice, exclude all the competing voices, and he realizes that I'm called to live a life of meekness, focus, direction, discipline. He comes out, he's more calm, he has peace, he embraces his mother. But my favorite part of that scene is kind of this thing at the end. It almost seems like a throwaway line, but actually it's a really important detail. So he comes out and hugs his mother, and he asks his mother, "Mom, what's wrong with me?" And when you look at the scene, all the mother does, she just looks at him with kindness and compassion and says, "Oh, Clark," right? But you got to read between the lines, right? So that whole thing, what's wrong with me? Two things going on there, right? So first of all, son, I see that you're in pain. And obviously, I'm not indifferent to that because I'm your mother, right? Whenever you're in pain, my heart goes out to you, my compassion, I suffer with you, right? So what's wrong with me? Yeah, I can see why you say that. On the other hand, Mom, what's wrong with me? Honey, you're Superman, right? So here's this thing which is uncomfortable and which is painful, but, dare I say, necessary. It's the way it's supposed to be. Every time we come to appropriate something which is new, there's some part of ourselves which needs to die to regain that new thing. So this whole thing about learning to navigate through the world and adopting the tools for spiritual warfare to learn the virtue of meekness takes time. There's a bit of a learning curve there, but that's okay. So if you're a young boy right now and you're going through birth pangs, if you will, even though it's painful, you are okay. What's wrong with me? Nothing. You have enormous power that you're learning how to control. One final example, I'll end with this. I was listening to this podcast called Pints with Aquinas, Matt Fradd. And he had on this young lady who was talking about struggles with sexual sin. And so the whole point of the episode was that sometimes women struggle with this too. And so the way this young lady told the story, basically she went to Steubenville University, a Catholic institution, and she was doing an oral exam with this professor. And the way she describes it, this guy wasn't just brilliant and amazing in that regard, but also he was very pastoral and holy. So even though it was an oral exam, at the end of the oral exam, she decided to take a chance and just self-disclose about her struggles. And the way she framed her particular fear was okay, Professor, I feel like because I've been struggling so much with this particular area of my life, I feel like, therefore, I don't have the capacity to love in the way that God calls me to love or in the way that I want to love. Because I've been struggling so much with this particular area of my life, I feel like, therefore, I lack the capacity to love in the way that God calls me to love and the way that I want to love. And how she tells the story is that at that point, the guy kind of paused and he looked down and he was praying to it for a second. And then he smiled and he looked at her and he said, "No, the reason why the devil is attacking you in this particular area of life is not because you lack the capacity to love. It's because your love has the capacity to change the world." And I want you to think about that. All the stuff we're talking about today in terms of meekness and integrity and discipline, saying no to competing goods, learning to live that life, there is a really steep learning curve. And it can be painful to kind of go through that particular dynamic, but the payoff is huge. And again, here's the point. Even right now, you have enormous power. And all you're learning how to do is to channel those things in the direction of the few things the Lord wants you to do carefully and well. And when you do that, you can change the world.